Please take your seat. Okay, let's get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this incredible book launch. You're going to see or hear about the work that is included in the book entitled Confronting the Resurgent Right. I'm going to do a few housekeeping announcements, and before I do that, I do want to ask one of our sponsors, our host from Mayworks, Emily Visser, to say a few words, and then I'm going to provide you with some more really important information, and then we'll begin the program.
Okay, welcome everybody to this fantastic event. I'm here to welcome you on behalf of Mayworks. We're very proud to co-sponsor this event. And right? We've had a spectacular 41st season of Mayworks so far. This is one of our closing events. And we are drawing to the end of the festival, so I hope you can catch a couple more things if you haven't seen them all yet. And I also want to recognize the importance of this new book. At a time when we're all looking for a way forward, and I know everybody here is committed to building the power of working people as we face down fascism through community movements, labor strikes, and art that speaks truth to power. I want to recognize this important new book because it brings together so many well-known and thoughtful and committed activists with a wide diversity of perspectives. So if you have contributed to this book, and I know there's a panel of people here, but there are more amongst us, could you please stand? Okay, if you're a panelist, you have to stand. All right, well, they don't want to stand, but there are other people among us who have contributed to this book, and so kudos to all of them. This is what Mayworks does. Our festival brings people together to empower artists and workers, bring the importance of the labor movement to the arts, and to bring the power of the arts to the labor movement to build worker power. Today, you're asked to buy this book, share it, read it, discuss it, and together, we'll be strengthening the movement for a more just world for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Before I begin, I do have a number of other sponsors to thank. So we heard from Emily from Mayworks, the University of Manitoba Press, the Toronto Workers History Project, and other story books, and the Leo Panage School. So thank you. Can we have some applause, please, for the sponsors? By the way, this space is wonderful. I think it's just, it's cozy, and it's enough for all of us to spend some time together. We're going to be hearing from our speakers very soon, so Miriam will be first. But before she does that, I would like to acknowledge the land that we're on. The land we're on has been inhabited continuously over 15,000 years. It is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee people, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. It is also the land of the Petun and Huron-Wendat peoples, and recognized officially as the land of the Mississaugas of the Credit River, as they were here at the time of contact. It is also the land of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe and other nations to share the resources and the caretaking of this land. Toronto, or Takaranto, is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. It is also the home of the red-tailed hawk, the eastern gray squirrel, the red fox, raccoons, white-tailed deer, bats, many insects, and other species, whom we should be respecting as we think about them being here with us on this land. While it's important to do land acknowledgements, we must recognize that it becomes quite performative, and it's like a checkbox kind of exercise. But I would like to take this particular moment to, first of all, recognize that we are on stolen land. We have really done a number on this land, so we need to keep on working to restore it, to bring it back, and have it used responsibly and with love and care. And we need to keep on thinking about that because we've made such a mess. So we're grateful to be on this land. We need to always think about who was here thousands of years before us. And because this is a settler colonial state that we're in, we have to also think about the effects of colonization on this land and why we are where we are today, all over the world, where colonization has done a number on the peoples that it has colonized. So thank you for that. So, we hear the word reconciliation all the time, but reconciliation cannot happen without conciliation, and there can be no conciliation without reparations. So again, something that I implore people to think about, reparations. What that looks like is a conversation we need to have, and in consultation with the peoples of this land. So we can't do it amongst each other, we should do it together with all of the people, the original peoples of this land, who still are here amongst us. So, without further ado, I am now going to be able to introduce our speakers. I'm going to go in the order that they will speak. I will provide a biography or a short bio for each one before they speak. Our first speaker will be Miriam Edelson, followed by Peter Smith, and then Tim McCaskell, Judy Rebick, and John Cartwright. So I think many of you know Miriam already. She is a writer, editor, settler, and mother living in Toronto. Her literary nonfiction and personal essays have appeared in Canadian newspapers and various literary journals in the United States, the UK, Canada, and on CBC Radio. Confronting the Resurgent Right is her fourth book. Over to you, Miriam.
Okay, thank you very much, Nuzhat. And Nuzhat is also an author in the book and has a wonderful chapter, which I hope you'll get a chance to read. I'd like to give a heartfelt thanks to the 18 authors who contributed to this volume. Tonight we'll have a chance to speak with 4 of them, and I suppose you'll have to read the others and learn something from their chapters as well. I thought I'd start with a bit of a definition. It comes from Barbara Perry's chapter, which was chapter 1 in the book. And she says that right-wing extremism is a loose reactionary movement characterized by a racially, ethnically, and sexually defined nationalism. It is grounded in white supremacist, white nationalist, racial separatist, and misogynistic and anti-queer beliefs. She points to the impact of the Trump presidency in the US, but also in Canada, which has been a flashpoint for the mobilization of right-wing extremism. For example, there's been a dramatic increase of hate crimes, up by 70% since 2019. And at the same time, online hate has escalated without limits. The right has moved, something we can notice, is that the right has moved more into the center of political discourse. They're no longer on the fringes, and I think that's something for us to be particularly concerned about. So we'll hear much more about the dangers of the right during this evening as the other speakers tell you about their chapters and their research. I want to read a little bit from the book, from the introduction, just to give you a sense of the origin story of the book. In late January of 2022, I was arriving in Ottawa to visit friends when we encountered traffic wrangles and were rerouted by the car's GPS. We could hear the rumble of trucks rolling into town in the near distance. The noise turned out to be from the self-described Freedom Convoy as it entered the city. Later that day, when I saw on television the trucks draped with Confederate flags and Nazi symbols, as a Jew and as a woman, I felt a deep stirring of emotion. Like many Canadians, I was shocked, even horrified, to see swastikas and other symbols celebrating racial injustice displayed so brazenly. I had been trained in political science and sociology, and I was both fascinated and utterly repelled by what I saw. My response was visceral, a combination of fear and anger at seeing displays of hate strut so close to our seat of government. I knew instinctively that the roots of that hatred run deep. I learned about fascism at my father's knee. I was 10 years old when he explained to me that he was not a pacifist because some forces in the world have to be fought. Fascism was one such force, and he had enlisted to fight in the Second World War because of it. My father was wounded on a beach in France, earning a Purple Heart from the US Army. He was not a man who glorified his memories of the war, but he did teach us to deplore the swastika and the goose step march of the Nazis and what they stood for. Back home in Toronto, I asked myself, what could I do to combat the right-wing politics and conspiracy theories motivating that odd conglomeration of people converging in Ottawa? Wanting to understand more about the right, its history in Canada and elsewhere, and its deepening impact on our politics and society, I felt compelled to act and recognized it was not something I could do by myself. I decided to ask people who study the right and those who militate against it from several different perspectives what they thought. I asked them to write about how the resurgence of the right has affected English Canadian society and what paths of resistance might be available to people and communities who want to counter them in the struggle for effective government and public services. In effect, I aimed to create a volume that would give voice to social movement representatives as well as academics concerned with these mushrooming issues. I wanted a book with strong evidence-based research and analysis of the genesis and modalities of the right as a basis for stories about how activists and their organizations are working against the right to develop potential roadmaps towards social and economic justice. The academic analysis contributes to our understanding of how advocacy can work. The social movement voices are informed by the academic analysis of the factual situation and represent a test of the analyses. It is in this way precisely that this book provides a unique contribution to scholarship about the rise of the right in Canada. I started this project with two related questions. One, how to understand the resurgence of the right in Canada, and two, what paths of resistance can workers and communities adopt to counter the far right? I believe some meaningful answers to these questions are offered in the various essays in this book. The point is not to claim the truth, but to spark conversations that challenge reckless conservatism. This book represents a unique approach in which intellectuals and organic intellectuals, activists, have come together to investigate a serious societal problem. It provides a combination of perspectives that shed light on the complexity of the subject in ways that give academic ground to activism and a militant voice to objective analysis. Going forward, we need to find a way to work together, to build coalitions in civil society, and to expose and counter the regressive forces that spew hate. This is now our most urgent collective task. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. Yes, I should have introduced myself because you must have been wondering, who is this woman? And why is she saying these things? My name is Nuzhat Jafri, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women. And I do have a chapter in the book on gendered Islamophobia and its impact on Canadian Muslim women. So now we're going to hear from Peter. Peter Smith is an investigative journalist, researcher, and photographer focused on extremist movements in Canada and Europe. He has earned credits producing documentaries and developing compelling multimedia journalism and a body of written work that exposed cults, gangs, and international neo-Nazi networks organizing in secret. His reporting is frequently cited by academics and the media, as Peter uses his online and face-to-face infiltration experience with the extreme far right to expose untold and underground stories. Over to you, Peter.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. I'm Peter Smith. I was an investigative journalist with the Canadian Anti-Hate Network for about 5 years, up until last year. Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to be able to contribute to the book. It has been a hot minute since I've done any public speaking, so I have some notes to make sure I kind of stay on track. So my chapter deals specifically with the active club and the men's nationalist clubs movement that has emerged since around 2020, and how that is an evolution or even a refinement of the racist skinhead activists that we saw in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, and were once kind of a force to be seen on the streets, including here in Toronto. So what does that all mean? So some very quick definitions. Racist skinhead activists are essentially neo-Nazis straight out of central casting. They are bald, braces, boots. They grew out of the skinhead movements from the UK working class, which was initially a left-wing movement of industrial workers who developed a fandom and a style related to reggae music. And then as the movement grew and expanded, there grew kind of factions within that movement, which included your traditional skins, and then gay skins, who were members of the LGBTQ community, and ultimately National Socialist skins, who came to unfortunately kind of embody what we think of when we say skinheads. That's all right. And then so the active clubs. The active clubs are a movement that started around the start of 2020. They were founded by an American white nationalist named Robert Rundo, who initially had run very formal organizations. They would provide kind of de facto security for Trump rallies ahead of and during the first Trump administration. And they would notably clash with anti-fascists until Rundo and several other members of his group RAM were brought up on rioting charges. Rundo would have the charges dropped, they would be reinstated, he would flee to Europe, which was ultimately 2 or 3 years ago when we wrote the book. He had just been apprehended at the time. He's since been released on time served and continues to be active in the movement. But he started the Active Clubs, which is a men's-only, whites-only, European far-right group of ostensibly workout clubs. They come together to train in physical fitness, they train in combat sports and martial arts, but ultimately they are a far-right organization that focuses on developing hyper-local chapters of an organization to mobilize and network among activists. What is unique about them is their organizational structure. Instead of Rundo being kind of the head of a spanning organization, which he may have learned his lesson about when he was brought up on criminal charges, instead is an influencer who through his company Will to Rise puts out documentaries, they sell clothing, he writes blog posts. He influences comments on this movement, but he doesn't instruct them. They adopt his ideology, they adopt the aesthetic that he has developed, which is much more clean-cut and I think socially acceptable than when we think of older skinhead movements. The best example to kind of demonstrate this is in Sweden. There were, I believe, 5 members of the active club in Stockholm who, while out at the bar one night, decided that they were going to randomly assault individuals who appeared to be immigrants. Most of them have faced jail time, but Rundo, besides being a foreign national, doesn't face any legal repercussions because he never directed them to do this. He puts out the message, he sets the tone, but the chapters themselves, while they exist as part of this broader movement, are autonomous. They operate without his directive. And then since then, and what I theorized would happen when we wrote the book, we've seen the rise of men's nationalist clubs, which follow a similar model to the active club. They might not align themselves with Rundo, they may not align themselves with the particular symbols and aesthetic, but they operate in a similar decentralized way, and these many disparate organizations manage to network themselves together. So they're hyper-local organizations, typically regional, that involve in-person vetting. They avoid the kind of pitfalls that large national organizations or even international organizations face by coalescing in one group chat that has multiple individuals from multiple countries or from multiple regions. They're very small groups of individuals, sometimes only a handful of people are involved in a chapter. But nonetheless, they still manage to network nationally and internationally. We've seen this in Canada. Probably one of our largest nationalist organizations is the Second Sons Canada, which is connected to the Diagolon movement. They have traveled to the United States to train with different active clubs and different nationalist clubs. The active club Frontenac, which is the Montreal-based active club, they've gone to California to participate in white nationalist martial arts tournaments, despite not being unified under the one single banner. They are able to come together, which I think is solving some of the fractural or faction-based issues within the far right that has kept them from succeeding with their movement or gaining at least a significant foothold. So when talking about these organizations, the main thing to consider is the risk. What is the actual threat posed by these organizations? The far right does not have a monopoly on the gym or on martial arts, and ostensibly there's nothing about groups of men coming together to train that is inherently problematic. What is the issue, and another researcher, Alexander Ritzman, who published probably one of the most comprehensive reports on the active clubs, he referred to them as a standby militia. These groups are firmly entrenched in conspiratorial beliefs that there is inevitable conflict coming between the races, that immigrants are being brought into the country by powerful Jewish cabals to kind of supplant the European population. And they are moving and preparing to kind of be the foot soldiers for a movement that they see coming down the line. While when they speak to the media or even some of their kind of apologists, will discuss the active club that is typically painted as just a closed men's workout group. But when you actually look at the symbols that they're using, which are commonly associated with neo-Nazi movements, when you look at the rhetoric and the publications that few of them put out, particularly Rundo, they talk very openly about a fascist future in which that they will be kind of the vanguard of. One of the chief risks as well is that they are a bridge between generations of far-right activists. If we look at, and to use their terms, if we look at the skinhead movement or the racist skinhead movement as white nationalism 1.0, and then the kind of internet age of a pseudo-intellectualized far-right and what was often called the alt-right during the 2010s as white nationalism 2.0, the active club is intentionally designed to be a marriage of those, and what Rundo calls white nationalism 3.0. The chief risk, though, that I think that they embody, and the one thing that they've done quite well, is that the far right has always been a fringe movement, particularly in Canada. Far right street organizations are urban phenomena. due to the way that our population is dispersed, the history of this country. If we're talking about, obviously systemic racism exists in smaller communities, but actual formations of neo-Nazis or white nationalists typically exist within major cities of Canada. Social media has changed that dynamic. Lone individuals who would be disconnected from the larger movement can reach out online to reach each other. And then the active clubs or the men's nationalist clubs provide a further bridge, whereas people can find small groups or even found them themselves. The only thing it takes to start an organization like this is a couple of friends and a cell phone. And then you can take images of that, of you guys working out in a park, of you guys throwing up Roman salutes, and then as long as you adopt the look and the name of the active club, that will be shared on an international network of tens of thousands of people that reaches hundreds of thousands of people. They are solving, the reason I say it is a refinement of the racist skinhead activism that kind of never really went anywhere or fell flat, is that they're able to kind of recast themselves and repaint their purpose, and ultimately it allows them to maintain their individual identity and avoid a lot of the infighting that typically prevents them from forming any kind of cohesive group. And thank you so much for the time.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. You were right on time. 10 minutes exactly. Amazing. By the way, there are chairs, empty chairs here. If anyone wants to join us up here, you can sit down. So please join us up here if you feel like it. So this is a description of Tim McCaskell by Tim McCaskell. He says, Tim McCaskell is a gay dinosaur from another planet. So I guess he's been at this work for a long time, that's what it means, but I didn't know that there were dinosaurs on other planets. Thank you for sharing that. So Tim is a longtime community activist. He's author of Race to Equity, Disrupting Educational Inequality, a history of the struggle of equity in Toronto public schools, and Queer Progress, from homophobia to homonationalism, a history of queer activism in Toronto. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you, and thanks to Miriam too for pulling us all together and including me and all the others in this volume, which I think is quite important, and to you all who have come out on such a beautiful evening. So my piece looks at the fights, the conflicts between the two LGBTQ plus communities, is the simplest way of saying it nowadays, and the right in Canada. And that this was not just that these kinds of things are connected to the crises in capital accumulation. I think we always need to keep that in mind. And I broke it into 4 major phases. The first was the gay liberation movement that I came out to in the 70s. And there the fight was with a hegemonic right? There were fascists and things around, but even though this was a period of Keynesian wealth redistribution, so socially more progressive, I suppose you could say, it was still culturally very, very, very conservative. It was a system that was under pressure from different kinds of movements. First was the national liberation movements that were shaking the developing world, the colonized world, and which in fact challenged much of the surplus that the Keynesian experiment was based on. But then in the imperial centers as well, we had the civil rights movement, women's liberation, black liberation, indigenous liberation, all of these kinds of groups that were beginning to challenge the conservative hegemony of that society. And gay liberation was inspired by that. That revolutionary wave came and went, and what we saw was that the queer movement became much more like the civil rights movements, looking for recognition and protection from the state within the parameters of liberal democracy. So that was that kind of first period. The second, in the later 70s and 80s, we saw a resurgent right, not dissimilar to what we're seeing today. And that was in the context of a crisis and accumulation in that Keynesian system. And people who are old enough, and I see enough white hairs in this room, remember stagflation, all the oil shock, all of those kinds of things which put that Keynesian system into real crisis. And so when a system is in crisis, you begin to see those people who are in charge looking around for different kinds of models and different kinds of ways of organizing capital to solve that crisis. Now, it's kind of hard to tell people, you should vote for me because I'm going to give you smaller pensions and take away your unemployment insurance and make your housing not work anymore, and that doesn't sell. But what you see is the construction of cultural movements that attempt to produce a bloc that is capable of actually dismantling the institutions of that Keynesian system. And that's what we did see. And one of the major ways of doing that was to stir up as much homophobia as possible so that queer people somehow represented the good old days that were being destroyed and now had to be eradicated in order to take us back to those good old days. That's kind of a wedge issue that produces a kind of a block. Now that period was also marked by the AIDS epidemic, which had contradictory effects. On the one hand, it further isolated queer communities, but on the other, it made us the legitimate focus of state-sanctioned public health efforts in order to be able to protect the general population. So on the one hand, it isolated people, but on the other hand, it gave further recognition to a community that had been invisible before. The third period, I think, is that period of mature neoliberal globalization. Capital accumulation has been stabilized. Class inequality has been augmented, has been increased enormously. And this period sees identity-based legal advocacy making real gains within a state that wants to portray itself as liberal and open and modern. And so that homonationalist period becomes a period where we see things like spousal rights and eventually gay marriage and all those protections that people kind of count on today. And now we're in this fourth period, in which the neoliberal system itself is in deep crisis. The American empire is in decline, and the kind of decay and anxiety that produces fuels all sorts of atavistic strategies, the Great America, Make America Great Again bloc, all of that kind of stuff. And like before, in the 80s, we see a targeting of queer communities, specifically trans communities these days, as well as immigrants and racialized people and women's rights. All of these things are aimed at producing this kind of bloc that is now much more nationalist, closed off, the end of the globalized system. It sounds like I'm talking about the States, but I'm also talking about Canada as well. It's like leaks across the border, and we've got our own issues as well here that produces those same kinds of effects. Most of the analysis in my piece focuses on this last period and the contradictions within the new we don't know quite what to call it. It's not neoliberal anymore, but it's something else. This new bloc of very conservative attempts to make America and Canada great again. They have very different attitudes around questions of sexuality. So there's the parliamentary group, the conservatives, the police, which have to be regarded as a political force in their own sense. The alt-right, the traditional religious homophobes, neo-fascist groups, all of these different kind of groups which are attempting to construct this new bloc. And contradictions within the 2S LGBTQ+ communities, which is increasingly stratified along class lines. And so that produces very different responses. Some people want to like fight fascists in the streets, and other people that want to ask the government for stronger laws to control things. The piece that I found really interesting in this book was Will Horter's The Hard Truth. To win, progressives must look in the mirror. I think there's this sense of seeing the rise of the right as almost like a natural phenomenon. You hear all sorts of metaphors about pendulums, you know, the swing right and left and right and left. And the bottom line in that is that they always end up in the middle, right? So don't worry about it too much, right? And I don't think that's a good analysis. I mean, I think we begin to see these things as connected with crisis accumulation and then attempts to rejig governance and change the social contract and all the disruption that causes and who has to get blamed for that. It doesn't work like a pendulum. And what I think Horter shows is that the right has worked much harder and more effectively in dealing with the kind of discontent and dislocation that this transition is causing, and making themselves useful for the people who really want to benefit from that kind of transition. He really details how this has been put together, how these different groups work, and the connections between those different kinds of things. So I think that this is a really important piece in terms of looking at the kind of things that we have to do too if we want to deal with the crisis that has to do with declining empire, concentrations of wealth and power like we've never seen before, and as well a new technical capacity to surveil and repress that no society has ever had before. I mean, those are three elements that scare me a whole lot. So the traditional response to fighting fascism has been the Popular Front, bring everybody together to defend liberal democratic values. But I think the Popular Front is useful, but it only really is effective if there is organization and mobilization that begins to look at the roots of this problem and begins to deal with these recurring crises and calls for a more fundamental change in the system so that the crises that spawn this kind of stuff don't continue to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really impressed with the panelists because they do end right on time. So Judy is next, and Judy Rebick is a phenomenon herself. She is a well-known feminist activist, writer, journalist, and educator. I will say she is a troublemaker, which I love her for. Her new book coming out early next year is called How to Be a Troublemaker. And she'll tell you how she's done that in the activism that she covers in the chapter. Go ahead, Judy.
Thank you very much. And thanks, Miriam, for inviting me. I'm not used to writing an academic book, so it took a lot longer. Do you mind if I stand up? I prefer to be standing up. It's gonna hurt, but yeah. So anyway, it took a long time. It was a long time ago I wrote my chapter, let's put it that way. And I wrote it on the pro-choice struggle because I think it's probably the most successful struggle we've seen out of the LGBTQ, which wasn't like one struggle, it was a series, whereas the pro-choice movement was kind of one movement. It started in 1970, the abortion caravan, and then came into the Morgenthaler stuff and so on. And in writing my own book, I really wanted to examine what was it about that struggle that was so successful, okay? And I'd like to say, oh, it's because it was led by socialist feminists. That's what I'd like to say. And there's some truth to that. There is some truth to that. But I think it's much deeper than that in the sense that we had a clear goal, number one, of what we're fighting for. That's much harder to do now because everything's falling apart at the same time. So we had a clear goal, which was, originally our goal was to to make abortion legal, and then we realized that wasn't the way to go, but to legalize freestanding clinics, because you could get an abortion in a hospital if a therapeutic abortion committee approved you, but you couldn't get an abortion otherwise, which meant middle class and upper class women, white women could get abortions and nobody else could. That's really what it came down to, right? And so Dr. Morgenthau, Dr. Henry Morgenthau, I look at the crowd and I think everybody knows who Dr. Morgenthau is. And he set up he was practicing in Montreal, and women came to him to ask for an abortion, and he didn't think it was fair that he wasn't allowed to give it to them, so he started performing abortions. And then he went public and said he had performed 1,000 abortions in his clinic. And this is in Quebec, in Montreal. And 3 juries acquitted him. Okay, 3 Catholic juries acquitted him. And so finally the PQ government says, we're not going to prosecute anybody under the federal law anymore. So we had the idea, Carolyn Egan had the idea actually, of starting an illegal clinic here in Toronto on Harvard Street, and we did that. And I got involved. I was in a group called the Revolutionary Marxist Group earlier. I quit. I had just quit. I knew I had to do something, so I went to a meeting in a place like this. And because I have a big mouth, I always had a big mouth. They asked me to be on the coordinating committee, and I became the spokesperson. Okay. So what I think the strength of that movement was first of all, it was multi-layered. So we did direct action. We did demonstrations, we did pickets. We had to defend the clinic against, and here's where we come to the fascists. The anti-choice weren't fascists per se, but they were brutal, okay? They were brutal, they were fanatics. They believed in something, which they believed that abortion was murder. They believed that in their hearts, in their soul. And therefore, they were prepared to go to any ends to stop it, including physical violence. So, like, I had to take self-defense courses, and I was physically attacked a couple of times, right? Which was something that was unheard of in Canada, right? Like, the way I became famous was a guy with garden shears attacked Dr. Morgenthau, and I defended him, and there were like 50 cameras there, so. You know, it was on, so that's how I became well known in the country, was from that moment. And so so that was one part of it. And but we didn't leave it to the court case, because we'd learned the lesson from the United States that just relying on the courts isn't good enough, because what happened in the United States was they won the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, and then the anti-choice organized and started pushing back, right? And that's happening now, by the way. The anti-choice, even though no political figure yet has said they want to make abortion illegal, they're in every place they can, they're pushing back on access, especially in rural places and smaller places. So we said, we can't rely on just the court case. Yes, we're going to go to court, we have to raise the money for that, et cetera, but we have to be out in the streets too. And we have to be in the community. We have to talk to people. Because even though the anti-choice are fanatics, right? Maybe like your guys in your gym, not your gym, but you know. The people they talk to, that they influence, you can talk to them, you can influence them, you can change their minds. Even if they come to you and they say, well, I don't agree with abortion, you know. Oh, okay, why, right? And then you talk about it. And we did this in labor conventions, we did it in churches, we did it in community groups. We talked to people about their views. And so we worked on all those levels, in the streets, in the community, and in the courts. And we had advantages that we don't have now, but I just want to say that that was a big part of the strength. The other thing is, we worked with people we hated, okay? Like, not just that we had differences, we hated them. You know, like there was a group of women, we used to call them the Rose Den Ladies, but they raised the money for the court case. We had no idea how to raise that much money. But they did, and they were pro-choice. We could barely speak to them, but we worked with them because we needed them for the movement. And this is a little-known fact, but when Mulroney tried to recriminalize abortion, the person who stopped him, the person who flew from Vancouver to Ottawa to vote against it in the Senate and defeat it, was Pat Carney, who led the fight for free trade for the Conservative government, okay? Okay? So, like, it was amazing that she did that, but she did that because we would talk to everybody, including Pat Carney. So, and this is something I think that is a problem now, right? Is that, like I say, like, we didn't agree with each other, we'd fight all the time, you know? I'm right, and I say, our generation is, I'm right and you're wrong. And this generation, new generations, the last couple of generations is, I'm right and you're a bad person, right? I'm never talking to you again, right? And that whole thing of cutting people off, that happens now, much more than it did back in the day. So I think that's important in terms of fighting the right. And the other thing is to talk to people. You know, I know it sounds silly, but it's true. Like, I think partly COVID and partly social media got us out of talking to people. And, you know, talking to neighbors, talking to, you know, talking to people in our workplace, talking to people we don't agree with. So the thing we did in the pro-choice struggle was we united across big and small differences. And I learned a lot from that. Like, for example, when the Catholic Church, and we had big forces against us. First of all the political parties were against us at first, including the NDP, by the way, or early days. Not the federal NDP, but the provincial, because Bob Rae said, we can't go against the rule of law, so the Ontario NDP can't support the clinic. We beat him on the convention floor, but that's what he said at first. So, you know, everybody was against us. Everybody in power was against us. We had no support. We had support from individual women, for sure, but no support from any institution. We did have some feminist journalists who supported us, for sure, and that was important. So we were up against huge odds, but we took the risk and we did the work. And we had a lot, and the other thing I want to say about that, and I don't think I say this in my chapter, is that Dr. Morgenthaler always told his story. And this is something else that I think is really important, which is storytelling. Because I think one of the things that's happened to the left has become very intellectual. Everything's about policy. And it's not about, and people sometimes can't relate to their lives to the policies we're talking about. Like, I just was at a panel discussion on care work, and you know, the speaker, the original speaker, talked about issues of care work and how, what Naomi Klein calls, what was that? She calls it?
Artist being raised.
No. Daddy.
Banker daddy.
Banker daddy. Yeah, that's a good name for him, Banker Daddy, Carney. Okay, I really hate Carney right now. Okay. So like how that guy gets away with what he gets away with, I don't know. But anyway, Banker Daddy, Carney. Now I lost. I said, I don't read notes. Okay, I lost my train, so we'll forget that story. Care work, yes, thank you, care work. So Nancy Wilson, who's the president, the CEO of the Canadian Women's Chamber of Commerce, which right now is the most militant feminist group in the country. I know you're not even going to believe me, but it's true. She had this idea to apply to the major projects office, you know, all the money going to construction and extraction, for a section on care work. It's really a great idea and a great initiative. And so we had a town hall this afternoon, and I wasn't speaking, but I was in there ready to discuss policy and this and that. And what happened was all these women started talking about the care work they did, and a lot of them were talking about caring for older, their parents, and how there's no support for it. how they almost lost their job over it, how they had a struggle over it, it was so interesting, right? That's what they really wanted to talk about, their lives, their struggle. What's going to make that better? And that's what the right has gotten better than us at doing. The right, and again, Naomi Klein, I love Naomi. She has a great line for this. She talks about the right harvesting rage, right? The right harvesting rage. And so the right does, and I remember going to Reform Party convention, the first Reform Party convention, and they had a workshop in which they were teaching organizing. And they learned that organizing from us, and now they're better at it than we are. And that's really hard to face. And so I see the age of this, the general age of the group here, which is like, I know 80% of you. And that's a problem, right? That's a problem. And this is why Abby Lewis's campaign was so great, because a lot of young people got involved, because politics is something, electoral politics is something they can relate to. But right now, movement politics in general, and I'm glad if someone wants to challenge me on this, is not engaging young people. It's really not. And we have to figure out how to do that. And I think the only way we're going to figure out how to do that is to talk more with young people and find out what their concerns are and how they want to deal with it.
All right, we did have John Cartwright who was going to speak, and if John is here, we'd love to hear from him. Otherwise, we are open for questions, and I do have some questions to start the discussion, if that's okay. I think, you know, as you were speaking, a lot of questions were going through my head. So for you, Peter, we hear in the news about neo-Nazi fight or active clubs that you talked about. Can you tell us more about them and what danger they pose? You talked about the risks, but given the climate we're in, and when you look at what Mr. Trump is planning, a UFC fight, you know, for his birthday. So this militarism, this violence, and the acceptance of violence for entertainment, where, you know, the actors may be these clubs. Can you enlighten us more about that?
I think what it does is it capitalizes on what is a very popular event, very popular type of activity that I think that there is a strong kind of appeal to youth when it comes to combat sports, to martial arts. Like I don't think that is confined, like I said, to the far right. But what it does is it creates that bridge which allows for a pathway into the far right. There are very few, I think, left-wing organizations or activist organizations that do aesthetics quite as well as the far right. And one thing that we see them talk about a lot is how they've created a new counterculture, how they are trying to kind of, they are what is on the outside of the mainstream, that, you know, the media, for instance, has embraced religious pluralism, and so that ethnic pluralism, you know, multiculturalism has become, you know, living in the city, just like a very real fact of life. And that they are, I think, very successfully positioning themselves as an opposition, not just to these principles, but to the kind of mainstream conception. I think especially in disaffected young white men who aren't sure where to place rage or where to place, you know, feeling unheard, that this presents an avenue for that that is very salient and is very successful. Yeah, I think that inherently it's not about demonizing the activity of like the training, but it's kind of all of the extras. It does promote this very healthy lifestyle. You know, their appearance is kind of, and I think by design, individuals that you would, you know, wouldn't be upset if your daughter brought home, but at the same time they promote very militant forms of the far-right ideology. Specifically, fascism, oftentimes you'll hear them talk about National Socialism, and other times it's much less specific than that. So it is about the aesthetic that appeals to a particular subset of young men in particular, where they found the most success.
Oh, scary still. But we shall overcome. Yes, I see Mr. John Cartwright has arrived. Mr. John Cartwright is in the room. John Cartwright is a carpenter by trade who has served in many leadership roles in the labor movement and civil society. He has helped initiate organizations such as the Campaign for Public Education, TTC Riders, Justice and Dignity for Cleaners, and the Toronto Community Benefits Network. John has been deeply involved in equity and anti-racism work for 5 decades and negotiated the first Ontario government racial equity hiring program in this century. In 2022, John convened the National Community Solidarity Project to respond to the freedom convoys taking place in Canadian societies. So welcome, John. Sorry to pull you right in. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, and welcome everyone, and thank you for being here tonight. This is an amazing book. I know you're going to enjoy it. I'm so sorry that I missed the rest of the panel. You know, every once in a while, when you know a woman who's been one of the most amazing labor leaders in this city in the half century of being a union activist, you got to go to a time when the elites of Toronto give her an award as a woman of distinction. I'm talking about Jenny Yon, who started in the social services sector, came out of CTCU, helped organize the Asian Canadian Labour Alliance, helped bargain retail workers huge rises of their income standards, their chain bargaining that broke all patterns, and has done so many other things. And I just got to say, this is a great priority, but when my sister, like my sister Yolanda McLean today, was elected as the first black woman of Coupey, Ontario, you gotta celebrate, right? Because it's a hard world, and when you have amazing leaders that you want to follow in their footsteps or point to the next generation, like, you gotta do this. So sorry I missed, but I've read all of your chapters, and I have a critique. No. So I'm a carpenter. I started by trade at age 18, and I just want to reflect on a couple things on the book, but I'm going to look at my notes for a second. Will Horton, I think, is the one who talked about being an environmental activist in the War of the Woods. Is that the right person, the last chapter? So it really came to me because as a construction worker, and you want to tackle the forces of all the crap, right, that is offered up to construction workers about being guys, about getting in your truck, about getting the job done, all that stuff. You got to figure out the language that says what the right offers is bullshit. It's no good for you. And sometimes you draw on what the ancestors taught us. And so when I was reading that story about the loggers, I think back to 1999. I was on the CLC Environmental Committee with amazing leaders from different unions from there, and I won't name them all. But one of them was from the Woodworkers Union at the time. And we were about to take a green jobs strategy forward to the 1999 CLC convention. And it covered all sectors. It was the first time a major national union central outside of Europe had passed such an audacious advocacy saying we could have a whole different clean economy and provide jobs for all. And the guy from IWA drives a Harley, gravel voice from drinking a bit of whiskey. He says, wait a minute, before we go along with this, I want to know what you mean by green jobs. I don't think Andy King was in the room at that time. I think it was one of your, maybe you were there, Andy. And so something popped in my head. I said, well, buddy, a welder who is welding pipe in the pulp mills where your members are supplying the logs to, and there's a different word that you use when you're part of the industry, so that you can change the process from a chlorine to a chlorine-free pulp process so that you can sell your product to Europe. That welder is doing a green job. And suddenly you could see the stuff going in his head, because that welder obviously probably drove a bike like him, probably drank in the same taverns as he did. Nick was part of that at the time. You know, and you could see him suddenly saying that makes sense. But when we got to the convention, the IWA was locked in a war with the woods. And they came, and I knew people from Lumber and Saw in Northern Ontario. They're part of the Carpenters Union that I was part of. And they came and said, John, we can't do this shit. Like, they are spiking trees. We've had members losing limbs because of that stuff. Like, this is bullshit. What are you going along with? And fortunately, I could draw from ancestors. There's a guy called Bruce Magnuson, who was head of the lumber and sawmill workers in the 40s and 50s. He was a communist. And in the late 40s, he wrote a pamphlet called Green Gold, How Our Communities Can Have Jobs for Generations to Come. So I sat down with the 40 members of the IWA and said, guys, and it was all guys, listen, this statement, this program, none of it's going to be decided. The forest products industry, there's no element of that program going to be decided by some carpenter from downtown Toronto. Your union, your experience tells us that you're the ones who will decide that policy. And I know you can do it because your union created this book in 1947, Green Jobs, Green Future, blah, blah, blah. And they all said, huh, can you give us a minute? So I went away. A couple months later, Freddie Miron comes back. Fred led the big fight against, in the late 90s when they all got thrown in jail. Boise Cascade. Fred comes back and says, okay, John, I'll tell you what, we'll abstain. And with that decision, we got a unanimous vote of a floor full of steel workers and auto workers and machinists and miners and construction workers, 100% saying, as a labor movement in this country, representing over 2 million workers, we can see a future in green jobs. So when I read the Hornton thing, I just thought, that just pulls up some memories. I want to acknowledge people like Nick, who's led the amazing work within the auto workers, even though he's an aircraft guy, but still the amazing work within the auto workers. Andy, who led the amazing work within steel, and I'm sure there's others I'm missing, in that pioneering hard work, because you're talking to blue-collar workers, asking them to change what they do and risk getting that employed. My community solidarity thing, I read a book called Democracy in Chains about 10 years ago, written by a woman, McLean, out of the US, and talks about how the oligarchs, particularly the Koch brothers and others, funded all that crap, including the Tea Party. And we saw what the Tea Party did. It looked like a bunch of whack jobs. But they were getting billions of dollars of funding to reframe the question. Not healthcare for all, but is Obama born in this country? Are they going to take away your right to have a healthcare plan at your work? All that stuff. And they made dramatic changes. And when I saw the Tea Party at work, that book informed me that this is a dangerous thing, and if it ever comes to Canada, we better do everything we can. And as we know, it came to Canada, first in the United We Roll, and then in the Convoy. And so we looked at what our good comrades in Ottawa were doing, with Community Solidarity at Ottawa. Amazing people like Alex Silas, who's now the Vice President of the Public Service Alliance, and Robert Fox and others, pulling communities together, the Billings Bridge fight, those other things. And we said, we need to do this at the national level, because these guys are coming to Toronto and blocking Queen's Park, they're coming to Hamilton, they're coming to London, they're coming to Regina and Edmonton and Winnipeg. And we pulled together a national table saying, can we actually have a united front? People here may be familiar with that. It was a guy who wrote a book a long time ago called United Front Against Fascism. And you have the core of people who are militant and understanding the class analysis, and then you bring a lot of allies. So we had the National Council of Churches, along with the Canadian Labour Congress, along with Unifor, along with the Canadian Federation of Students, saying, how do we organize so when they come into town, there's way more of us saying, no, that's not what Hamilton stands for. No, that's not what London stands for. This is not what Regina stands for. And that was the origin of the Community Solidarity Project. And And it's the kind of thing that got us in some trouble. It's not without controversy. Sometimes some of us, when we drive forward, for me, because of what I've seen in my life, because of the unbelievable explicit racism poured against people I work with, or even when I was in the Army Reserve, the people I serve with, it's a raw nerve. And when I see people wanting to play the politics of division, I lose my shit, and I'm ready to punch somebody out. And I've had to threaten to do that with somebody talking racist crap in the workplace. But as a leader, you got to draw people together and ask their wisdom and their knowledge. And we look at what our ancestors have done generation after generation, particularly in this city, making hard decisions, allowing us to come from 196 countries and speak 100 languages and live in relative harmony, because they figured shit out. And we built on that, and we said no to racism and sexism, and we talked about queer rights, and we talked about climate change, and we said our kids deserve a better future together, and that's why we're investing in public education and healthcare and community services like those brave OPSU social service workers who are on strike right now, 4,000 of them. Each one an individual advisor, having the guts to go on the street and saying what we do, how we care for people, is worth being properly respected and paid, and the funding to the agencies who work at needs to be there. Because the Canada we want to build together is not there when somebody's talking about tax cuts instead of investing in our neighbors. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tim. Sorry, not Tim, Peter.
Tim's a
Oh,
smart
Peter's
guy.
here.
Tim's a smart guy.
John. No, the reason, actually, Tim, I'm going to ask you a question. That's why I said thank you, Tim.
And I got a few questions for him too.
Okay, and you will get a chance to talk to each other, but I'm going to ask Tim this question. So there was a time when the 2S LGBTQ plus movement aligned itself more with the left and broader struggles for social justice. Can you say something about this and why you think it is missing today? I think you've alluded to it briefly in your remarks. In your view, what needs to change for the movement to more fully embrace social justice issues as an objective?
I guess I would say, first of all, you talk about the 2S LGBTQ plus movement, but there really isn't a movement, right? There's a bunch of NGOs that mostly get their funding from government or corporate, who do social service works and training and stuff like that. And when anybody needs to talk to the community, these are the people they talk to, because those people are the ones that have offices and do all that kind of stuff. So I think that there's still lip service paid, but that many of the people in those NGOs feel more comfortable having a chat with liberal cabinet ministers than they do with people on a picket line, right? It's their social services. Neoliberalism has done this number of, a community is a community when the elements that unite people are greater than the elements that divide people, right? It's not when we talk about identity communities. And there's always been all sorts of differences around race or class or gender, all those kinds of things. But when the issues that unite you suddenly are stronger than that, then you can produce a movement. And I think that the brilliance of neoliberalism from the point of view of ruling classes is that they produce class distinctions that mean that communities are no longer really communities, right? We get together for a party on Pride once a year, but other than that, people don't even know each other. And so there has been a slow erosion of that attempt to unite with other groups. So one of the big things, remember after the Bath raids, the Right to Privacy Committee, we made sure that other groups that were in conflict with the police spoke at our meetings and at our demonstrations. There's like this picture of Lamona Johnson, whose husband was gunned down by the cops in their home after kind of a wellness check, murdered basically. And she spoke at one of the huge rallies that we organized around Queen's Park after the Bath raids. This is a working class Jamaican woman, right, who probably had never had nothing to do with questions of gay rights before that. But we recognized those kinds of commonalities. Now not so much. And there's no one even to ask those, to ask for those kinds of things. So yeah, I think it's a problem that we're living in a much more fragmented and divided society, and that the notions of community and movement really are, I won't say things of the past, perhaps they're things of the future, but right now they're not really operating.
Judy?
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I was going to say that in my talk, but I lost track. The same thing happened in the women's movement. There isn't really a women's movement anymore. There's women's groups. Most of them are service groups. They have been deeply co-opted by the Trudeau Liberals. I don't know if that's better or worse than what's happening now, but anyway. And they don't know how to organize. Like they did, there was, when Carney cut back funding to women's group by 85%, they all signed a letter. Okay, that's the extent to which there's a movement. They all signed a letter that CREA started. But otherwise, there's not a real movement, and there's no notion of organizing that I can see. And so I think Tim's analysis of the impact of neoliberalism on movements is really, really important, because I see it in the women's movement. I didn't have the words for it, but he in his article, he puts words to it, that's what's happened. And in essence, there's not a movement like there used to be, where you could call out to different groups to come out in solidarity. It's just not there anymore.
So
yeah, but that's like the left still, the one place it exists is an IWD, because the labor leadership is really, and left-wing feminists run IWD and have leadership. But other than IWD, I'd say, other than IWD, we don't see a movement in the same way.
I think, Miriam, you have a comment, and I'm going to give you some good news about a movement or what the feminist organizations are doing together.
Okay, good.
I would say, Judy, that there's a nascent movement happening between national women's organizations now. And that letter is one indication. But people are talking to each other now, and they're working together on a project about how they should be funded, which they're not funded properly, as we all know. So I think there's something that's happening there.
Well, that's good to hear. That's good to
So
hear.
I was just going to say that, a comment on that. There are 10 national women's organizations, feminist organizations that have come together to do the advocacy, to improve funding. One of the reasons why it's so necessary is because we lived through the Harper years where we had a precarious existence, and some of us had to close our doors. So it has propelled us to, under the current leadership of the federal government, to take action. We just can't sit back and watch, funding being taken away, or going back to the wilderness, the previous administration before Trudeau. So it's happening, and we do meet. We had a meeting just this morning, so we meet regularly. And I think, another example I can give you. I don't know if you'd call it a movement, but we, the feminist organizations, and a whole lot of feminist organizations, supported Queer Momentum, an organization of 2S LGBTQ plus organizations. The activism was around supporting trans rights because of the attack on that movement. I would call it a movement, by various governments happening across the country. So there are possibilities. Anyway, I shouldn't take up the time as the moderator. I do have questions. So Judy, you may have actually answered part of this, because you talked about talking to each other. And you often speak about working across difference. Can we expand a bit on this notion and perhaps give an example from your activism where it has worked. You gave us an example, but maybe there are other situations where that has worked for you.
Well, pretty well everything I can think of. If you're fighting on a particular issue, you have to work across differences. I mean, and John talked about it too, and said it him. Like there's no way to organize without organizing across difference, because you don't start when you're fighting on an issue. Now the problem, I think, is that we can't fight anymore on individual issues, because there's a whole series of issues, right? But the thing is what was the United Front Against Fascism were like communists and socialists who hated each other with a passion that was great, right, greater than we've seen, uniting to fight against fascism, right? And so that's where it comes from, that idea. But even in smaller ways, that if you want to, if I'm thinking about on a particular issue, I mean the pro-choice issue, on violence against women, we've had to do that. On every feminist issue I've been involved with, every labor issue I've been involved with, you're working with people who you have a goal, you're fighting on a particular issue or a particular set of issues, and you have to work with people that you don't agree with on other things. Look at the environmental movement, right? Like people in the environmental movement, there's people who are very radical, like Greenpeace are doing I don't know if Greenpeace still does direct action, and there's people who, all they want to do is write policy papers or speak to liberal politicians, but they work together, they unite on issues, particularly issues of, a particular pipeline or a particular proposal by the government. I mean, right now, I think there's a coalition forming on care work, right? There's a lot of people writing papers on care work, but right now, if we don't organize a coalition to get funding for care work, and I think the way to do it is what CanWC has done, which is make it part of the major projects office. If we don't do that, the attacks against care work are going to get worse. And that means that we have to unite business women with unions, with self-employed people, because that's who's being affected, right? And they have a common interest, which is to get the government to see care work as part of the economy, right? It's not just industrial jobs that are the economy, right? So that's a good example in the present time, that we have to make those coalitions.
Great, wonderful. So one last question for John, then we'll open it up for the audience. John, what do you consider the greatest barriers to communities organizing to resist the right? And do you see positive signs on the horizon for this type of organizing? You gave some examples. What else could we all be doing? Because we do need to resist. Because what I've seen is, unfortunately, what happens south of the border comes here eventually, but they have Jim Crow 2.0 happening. So what do we do?
One of my mentors was an old Ukrainian iron worker called Judy Rebick. He was in the Canadian Seamen's Union. And in the late 40s, when they brought Hal Banks up to it, Joe had been clubbed, thrown in jail by the cops. He'd been fired at like guns by the mobsters that Hal Banks brought here. And in construction, we have 14 different unions. And so we're always spending time saying, that's my work, not yours. And that can be a huge fight. But Joe always used to tell me when I was a young pup wanting to change the world and, blah, 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 blah. He said, John, working class only has three things. Unity, unity, and unity. That's all we got. So when we think of the working class, don't look like me. And who's the working class in the city today? It's the OPSU healthcare workers at Sutton Place there who look after autistic adults. It's the folks that I was with yesterday on Monday at Broadview Avenue, Salvation Army, who, help do the beds and do all those other things. It's those IT creative, like wonderful, crazy young kids doing digital animation that just signed and got a union with IATSE, hundreds of them in British Columbia. What? Right? It's The Walmart warehouse workers in Mississauga who just ratified the first collective agreement in history of Walmart workers anywhere in North America. And they come speak about 20 languages in that warehouse. It's partnering with groups like Migranti, who are saying, we're going to be there. When it's your young people who are TFWs or foreign students who are working in Amazon friggin' warehouses, we're going to help big up the Filipino voice in working class politics, but also in your communities. And it's time talking to the student federations, and they've been gutted also. The laws that Harris has brought in, they don't have the same capacity they used to do when, back in the day when the student movement was massively important. But there's people like Acorn. Anybody here heard of Acorn? 160,000 people take $5 a month out of their pocket and pay an organization to try and have a voice for a better place in their apartment building, and to challenge moneylenders and to challenge the right to have Wi-Fi, because you can't do nothing without Wi-Fi these days. Acorn is a mass movement in this country. Poor people. That's probably the most effective mass movement that I know of in this country. I was the chair of Council of Canadians for a bunch of years, and we live from the legacy of Matt Barlow when we were a huge force challenging bad trade and privatization. But people are my age now. And we're trying to figure out, I've stepped back, but they're trying to figure out how do we take the next generation to pick up the torch. Looking for those things, and I'm going to give you one example. The World AIDS Conference came here. The hotel workers' agreements were all up. They had incredible bargaining power. They went to the employers and said, we may have to shut down the hotels. If you're not going to respect those roomkeepers who are having to work 2 jobs, the roomkeeper who walked in the Labor Day parade with a sign on her back said, I have made 56,420 beds in my career, and my back hurts. If you're not going to respect them, shit's going to happen. But they didn't do it by themselves. They brought up Cleve Jones, who was the founder of the AIDS Quilt, to sit with their leaders and explain why the queer community took AIDS on as a public health issue, not a queer concern. And why the union, Unite Here, connected with the queer community with the slogan, if you're going to be a tourist and you're going to stay in a place, sleep with the right people. And that was the name of the program. But they have a lot of fundamentalist Caribbean women working there, a lot of Muslim members, a lot of Filipino and China, and strong Christians who were really uncomfortable of having 2 guys in a bed doing what adults consenting do, and then being the one in it. So they undertook an education process with all of their team leaders to say, this is why we are allies of the gay community. Just think about the conversations that had to happen. With somebody who's going to their church every Sunday and they hear about a version of the Bible, and they're now being asked in the name of solidarity and union power to welcome those gay guests and to put aside their right to pull the trigger on that strike in conjunction with leaders of the gay community. That's what they call solidarity. But that union had shown that it could be trusted, because time and again, when one of those housekeepers were in trouble, Andrea Babington, who's now the president of the Labor Council, would walk into that hotel and say, there's a meeting at lunch. And by the way, the meeting might be a few hours. And managers would go nuts, and they'd say, we're going to call the cops. And Andrea would say, go ahead. If you want any guest to get served anything in the next few weeks, we're going to have that meeting. And by the way, tomorrow, if you diss what that worker is, tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock, we're going to have a lovely information picket line with those plastic drums outside of the windows, so all of the guests at this hotel know what a problem it is. So the creativity combined with a commitment to learning and sharing, that's what gives me hope. And when we see yet another set of workers saying the care economy is worth being, and we'll be on the picket line for the first time ever to do that, that's what gives me hope. when the Society of Energy Professionals went on strike in for 105 days to say, you will not pay the next generation less than us. We're not going to lose a penny, the people on the picket line. I could go back to work tomorrow and get all my full wages and benefits, but you will not do this. And Michelle Johnson was fired for her militancy and became later on the leader, as an indigenous woman, the leader of the Society of Energy Professionals. That's how we figure this shit out. We ask our ancestors, we look at the best stories, we pull that inspiration, and we share it with others.
Thank you. Wow. Okay, so maybe we were, feeling a little down and worried about the future. But I think, wouldn't you say that our speakers have given us hope? So a big round of applause for each one of them. And I'm sure there's a great incentive to read their chapters. Maybe we have a few minutes for a couple of questions from the audience.
Well, the one place that I've done it is in Avi Lewis's campaign, and I think it's on Sunday, there's a Toronto meeting of the Avi Lewis campaign, and there's a lot of young people involved in that, and so that's a place to start. Like I say, I was on this panel this afternoon, and I was kind of blown away by what happened, which is people didn't want to talk policy, they wanted to talk about their lives and the struggles that they've gone through. And I was really frustrated by that, but I kept my mouth shut. So I think part of it is I've written a book, or I'm writing a book called How to Be a Troublemaker, Trying to Share Wisdom. But I think we also have to listen to young people about the world they're living in. And it's not the same world that we came up in. And a lot of the lessons don't work in their world, right? So I think that it's a conversation that we have to have. I started Rabble in 2001, okay? It was the first independent left-wing newspaper in Canada. And it was the first, Babel was the first social media in North America, okay? And like my family said, if you weren't into making money, we'd all be rich now. But anyway, I was strictly nonprofit. So we had a dream, okay, that that social media, or what we then called the internet, would democratize the media, democratize everything. And the exact opposite happened, right? Because the tech bros took control and blah, blah, blah. Now we're, and I'm going to say this on the social media side, now we're in the AI time. And so we have to look at that in a way of who controls it, because we can't just not use it. That won't work. It doesn't work to just not use it. So then it's who controls it? If it's public control, I suggest you look at the Mozilla Foundation for that. In terms of talking to young people, again, I think it's something that what happened in Avi's campaign, which surprised all of us, including Avi, is that we had this first meeting. Was it here at the Transact Club, or it was I think it was actually here. Anyway, we had a first meeting in a small place, location, like this, okay? And the energy in the room was electric. I don't remember feeling anything like that since the pro-choice struggle. And this young guy comes up to me and says, I was making buttons all day. You want a button? Like, okay, sure. Like, the young people that were there were so excited because they'd never experienced the joy of coming together. And that was happening in every meeting that Avi had across the country, is that young people were coming because they were interested, and finding that in a meeting of like minds, there's a sense of joy in talking about getting together and fighting back. Now that's easier to do in the union because you have meetings, but I think having in-person meetings is really important. I know it sounds crazy, but And having those meetings, not just having like this meeting, everybody just talking to each other, but also having musicians in the meeting. I mean, that's what Avi did too, having musicians, having singing. Like I went to, a friend of mine had a book launch, and at the end of the book launch, she led a sing-along. And I mean, the book launch was much better than most. You know, it was good, short, and so on and so forth. But then when she had the sing-along, it was joyous. And everybody felt great, right? I'm not going to lead a sing-along, but if somebody wants to, I'll just say what I want. So I think it's really kind of simple. It's simple, is to get people in a room to have discussion and have fun. And that's the way to bring young people into the movement.
So my background, I think, is very different than a lot of people's here. And I haven't been part of a union. I've worked with some anti-fascist activists, but I kind of made my bones infiltrating white nationalist groups. I look the way that I look, and I grew up where I grew up, and I was a construction worker long before I was a journalist, and a member of the military. It allowed me to have some cachet and some buy-in from individuals. I've seen what motivates young people towards action, not the action that we would like, but one thing about extremists and radicals is that they're inherently optimists. They believe that you can take a certain action and that can have a real and sustainable impact on the world. And you give them very clear goals as you build them towards something else. And that can be as simple as putting up posters. It can be as simple as in-person meetings. These do build a real solidarity. You take aesthetics and things that appeal to them, and you can start to build a movement of youth through very small action that eventually builds into something else. And I've seen this used in incredibly negative contexts. And on the converse side, and being in Ottawa during the Convoy, and being on the ground for a lot of that, seeing the opposition build in a very similar way, I think that, yeah, ultimately we have to find a way to engage people and engage youth and get them, yeah, off of social media into real life action, but developing something that they feel that gives hope that even small action can build towards something else is ultimately one of the most engaging things that we can do.
I agree with you, and I was, as you know, involved in the pro-Palestinian, the anti-Zionist movement. And yes, there was tons of young people, but it doesn't seem to be translating to other movements, and maybe we could talk later about why that is. It doesn't seem to be translating to other movements, and I'm not sure why that is. But it's something that I know we don't have time now, but that we should be discussing.
Sure, and John, and then the question back there. Go ahead.
I think that's a very important question. Crisis opportunity. So at the CLC convention, the left was completely focused on winning the resolution on hot carbon. Avi Lewis came to the CLC convention, he talked about that. He did not mention the word Cuba. 0.5% of the attention of the left in this country is on Trump about to crush Cuba. Despite its imperfections, it calls itself socialist. It's 90 miles away from Miami. We have not yet figured out how to push Carney. Sherrod Mines sold the largest industrial venture in Cuba because of the gun at the head of Sherrod Mines. And all the passion about the horrific genocide in Gaza and other things have completely overshadowed a human experiment which motivated so many of us in the 60s and 70s to want to be revolutionaries, to see what that was about. And millions of Canadians have gone there. They care about the people who made their food and made up their beds and looked after their kids. And our liberal governments here are nothing because all of our attention is on Gaza. And I want to, not that that shouldn't happen, but if we let Trump crush Cuba, will we be honestly saying we've done the right thing? I watched a video of a skating party that Mayor Chow had shortly after she was mayor. And David Langill and Susan McMurray, who are lifelong anti-fascists, Susan has organized the flying squad of the Labour Council that goes along with Carol Negan and physically confronts the fascists and the Islamophobes. And when two people angry about Gaza started screaming at Mayor Chow, you can't hide, you go along with genocide, David Langill skated up to them to explain that this wasn't really a helpful thing to have on TV. And they took a video of David skating to them and said he was effectively an apologist for white supremacy and he should be shamed. And 300,000 people saw that video. And I've been a labor leader movements for years, and I've never had that many people looking at my image talking about social justice. So the issues of sectarianism and making it impossible for people to support a cause has to be talked about in a very serious way. And I know it ain't popular, me, a straight white guy, saying that, but I've had a friend who was my apprentice who served in Vietnam, saw horrors that woke him up every single night of his life until he took his own life. I have no sense of the horrors that are impacting right now in Gaza and Palestine and Lebanon, although I have a sense of what that turns people's lives into. So recognizing that that's brought people a certain level of activists to say, how dare our government not speak out? How dare our movement not speak out? If we are there and we let Cuba be crushed, if we're not talking about the cost of living crisis for most young families that can't afford to put a roof over their head, then we're failing them. And the right will say, look at the housing hell video of Pierre Poilievre. 5 million people saw that. The blame for all the housing costs is nothing to do with the greedy speculators and developers. And I come out of the industry, I know those guys by first name. And they're taking bags full of money down to the Bahamas, to tax havens that the federal government's giving them now. And my daughter, who's a lawyer, couldn't afford to buy a house without the bank of mom and dad. And if we're not talking about that as well, as Avi did in his opening speech at the CLC convention, and the cost of groceries, they ain't gonna be there. But I'm gonna end on a good way. There's a lady that came here once and said, I don't want a revolution, I can't. And what was her name?
Emma Gold.
And there's been a play done by Teresa Tova about Emma Goldberg. The farm workers, when they came here in 1970 asking us to help do the farm worker boycott, they brought music. Look at the movie Bread and Roses about justice for janitors. There's music. Look at the concerned Guyanese when they fled what the dictatorship had done to Guyana and they were fleeing for their lives coming here. They have music. The Association of Concerned Guyanese put on a dance once a month so those young people can go and jump up. And I learned how to jump up and go to Caravana from 1975 on because they understood you need music and art and culture. And Mayworks, who's a co-sponsor here, started by giving people an idea that you could have a revolution to dance to with arts and poetry and photography and film. And guess what? On Saturday, June the 6th, the Ethiopian and Eritrean Workers Network is being sponsored by Mayworks to rebuild itself. The co-chairs are people a little younger than me, but Mayworks hired a young Ethiopian Canadian woman and said, let's try something. Let's bring people together. Let's have some fun and talk about what's going on and figure out some of the old folks, how we'll help the next generation be part of building the country that they want. And by the way, there may be great injera and there may be fabulous music, because the first time that group met was at Herut Cafe, the jazz center for in East Toronto. And those young Ethiopian and Eritreans figured out how they could come into the skilled construction trades because of the work of that network. And you know, when you're young, you want to make sure you can put a roof over your head and maybe raise a family. And if somebody's talking about that, and by the way, you can have fun at the same time, that's what sustained our movements through all of humankind.
I think the Popular Front is very important, But one of the components of that popular front has to be a group of people that are pushing for more fundamental change. Simply doing the fundamental change piece, that can get you isolated, right? It's producing that kind of connection, talking across those kinds of differences that I think is really important. So popular front, a united front, there's always this debate about Washington. But there has to be a progressive component that goes beyond simple liberal democracy, otherwise it'll give up too soon.
Thank you. That's good. So please go ahead, Maureen. We're going to wrap up now. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation.
Hi, everybody. I wanted to thank everybody for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it. Confronting the Resurgent Right emphasizes the need for organizing in our communities, collectively against the rise of the right. And whether this is to protest sky-high grocery prices and back the demand for public grocery outlets, or, as is recounted in one chapter, organizing against anti-trans elements at a community school, the one in the chapter is about Ottawa. There are many opportunities for us to resist the right's resurgence. By working together, by working respectfully across differences we may have with one another, we have a chance to create a bulwark against the right's advances. Some tools are evident in the chapters here, and at the back of the book there is a listing of organizations across the country that are engaged in these politics. Most of them welcome volunteers. So if you're not already involved, I hope you will join us in the struggle. Thank you very much for coming.